Hello. So, we've been talking about some Neville, and Neville's practical, but also, as I often mention, it can fall into kind of like more vague, beautiful but vague spiritual recommendations. And even someone like Joseph Murphy, he uses a fair amount of spiritual language, like the power of your subconscious mind. If you're not a religious person, there's definitely the chance that that book's going to rub you the wrong way. Um, and so, later this week, I'm probably, planning on releasing a podcast episode that's like way out there, like one of my meditations, um, that's way out there. So that doesn't really even have to do with manifesting or anything like that. It's just like way out there, relaxing into the abundance of now, like viscerally. Which I also think is really interesting and important for a lot of us to do. But this is all a lead-in for today's video. My point is that I want to just remind people and remind myself, as I like to do very often, of the practical element of so many of these manifesting and law of attraction, law of assumption ideas, which is practical and almost separate, one could say, or generally speaking, separate from any far out spiritual concept, really. There's not a direct link between spirituality and a lot of this stuff. A lot of this stuff you could boil down to like practical yet not really understood psychological principles. And I'll put a link to a video above, a podcast episode I did just that talks about this. I talk about this somewhat often. I think it's important to almost separate your spiritual quote unquote practice, or just spiritually, what you are, with these very practical psychological law of assumption, law of attraction, manifesting ideas. They're almost two separate things, at least a lot of the time. And let's just do something totally practical today. I think I've read this paragraph before, but I want to read some Emile Coué, my favorite, law of attraction teacher, for these very reasons, that he's just so darn practical. So practical. And the paragraph I'm going to read today, it ties so well into what we were exploring with Joseph Murphy's stuff in that chapter for practical techniques for mental healings, and some of these recent Neville passages that I've been reading. Here is this paragraph that Coué wrote. He wrote, "If you induce in yourself a belief that you can do a certain thing, provided it conforms to the laws of nature, you are going to do it, no matter how difficult it may be. If, on the contrary, you imagine that you cannot do the simplest thing in the world, it becomes impossible for you to accomplish it. A molehill may become to you an unsurmountable mountain." As I often say, Self-Mastery Through Conscious Auto-Suggestion is the best law of attraction book of the last 100 or so years. And there's so many good lines. It's really hard to just choose like certain lines. But this line you could like have hung on your wall. It's so good. If you induce in yourself a belief that you can do a certain thing, provided it conforms to the laws of nature, you are going to do it, no matter how difficult it may be. You hear my stomach growling? I just agreed with that. If you induce in yourself a belief that you can do it, as I often say, I think the usage of saying laws, the law of this, the law of that, the law of this is so overplayed when it comes to talking about this stuff. But something that Joseph Murphy says in The Power of Your Subconscious Mind is he says there's the law of belief. And that's pretty darn good. The law of belief, which I think Coué kind of summates in this sentence. If you induce in yourself a belief that you can do a certain thing, you're going to do it. It doesn't matter how difficult it may be. If you induce yourself, if you convince yourself, if you induce in yourself, if you imaginatively convince yourself, if you believe that you can do a certain thing, you're going to do it, as long as it falls within the laws of nature, the confines of nature. And I'm not going to get into a discussion about what that means. If you want to talk about theoretical, what does it mean? Conforms to the laws of nature. Go to some other channel. But practically understanding what Coué is saying here and what Murphy's often saying, and what we were going over in that last chapter of his, a week or two ago, is again, the backbone of so much of this practical law of attraction, law of assumption, manifesting stuff. If you induce in yourself a belief that you can do something, you will do it. It then becomes about inducing the belief. How do you induce the belief that you can do it? How do you do it? How do you induce that belief? And there's no one right answer, right? I would say obviously there's no one right answer. But it's not obvious to a lot of people. They think you have to do it a certain way. That there's one special technique, the best technique, like I was talking about. I'll put a link above. What I was talking about last week about the best technique. The best technique is what works for you right now. It's what helps you induce the positive belief that you want. Inducing the belief. The law of belief. This is, again, deceptively simple and very simple to say. For most of us, much harder to implement with consistency and dependability. And that's why I say do whatever you can to induce the belief of what you want. Doesn't matter what it is. Do anything. Anything. I'm going to read it one more time, this paragraph. Again, this is as good advice as you're going to hear when it comes to these principles. If you induce in yourself a belief that you can do a certain thing, provided it conforms to the laws of nature, you are going to do it, no matter how difficult it may be. If, on the contrary, you imagine that you cannot do the simplest thing in the world, it becomes impossible for you to accomplish it. A molehill may become to you an unsurmountable mountain. So I think it's worth considering, how do I induce a positive belief? How do I do that? And like I said, that first sentence is really the kind of sentence you could have framed on a wall, or the kind of sentence you could have on your phone that you look at every day, just to remind you. This is the practical psychological practice of implementing these principles. I would argue that it has very little to do with or very little to do with deep underlying spiritual truths, that the unfathomable, right? There's something unfathomable about how this belief thing works, but this is about practically applying it in your life. We don't have to get particularly esoteric in order to do that unless we want to. The important thing is just doing it, figuring out ways to induce beliefs that we can get behind, that we want to believe. And that's, again, what so much of this stuff really boils down to.